Our first speaker today is Don H. Doyle, who is speaking on Reconstruction in International Perspective. Don is a professor emeritus at the University of South Carolina and the author of a number of books, including The Cause of All Nations, an international history of the American Civil War. So please let us give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I thank Vernon and Peter for all they did to organize this wonderful conference. What I'm going to talk about today is about a quarter of what I promised. I noticed in my little précis on this paper. But it's on a sequel to The Cause of All Nations, and I'm calling it Viva Lincoln, an International History of Reconstruction. My story begins with the extraordinary international reaction to Lincoln's assassination across Europe and Latin America and Canada, all parts of the globe. In the end, people stopped what they were doing when they heard the news. They milled about in the streets to learn more about what was happening. They bought special editions of newspapers that were printed to serve this hunger for news. Some stood vigil outside of US diplomatic posts around the world. Some formed processions and marched in silence through the streets. Masonic lodges in Paris fired off haunting mortuary salvos. They draped flags in buildings in mourning and wore black armbands. Cubans, slave and free, wore images of Lincoln. Towns, streets, and children were named in Lincoln's honor. Overnight, he had become a global hero, a martyr to Republican ideals. After this initial shock came a series of condolence messages that were issued by public meetings. They met in town halls and in churches, in taverns and union halls, and students met in lecture halls to draft resolutions of condolence, expressing sympathy and grief, outrage and indignation, and often rebuking their own leaders for not standing by America and Lincoln in their hour of need. In Paris, between 2,000 and 3,000 students spilled out of a lecture by history professor Edouard Labolie, a great historian of America and a stalwart friend of the Union during the war. They gathered in the Latin Quarter at Pont Saint-Michel, planning to march en masse out the Champs-Élysées to the private home of US Ambassador John Bigelow. Police came out of the prefecture not far from Pont Saint-Michel, swords drawn. They broke up the demonstration. They arrested several students. Others scattered and made their way about 3 miles out to Bigelow's house. There, they found a cordon of police guarding the door at Bigelow's house. They broke through the cordon and went into Bigelow's house. Now imagine an astonished US ambassador with angry French students coming into his house. But they were there, of course, to praise Lincoln, to praise America, and to issue a message of condolence. They finished after Bigelow, in his very best French, responded to them that he would forward this message to America and to President Johnson and Mrs. Lincoln with loud Viva Republic, Viva la Grande Republique, and Viva Lincoln. Dozens more came to Bigelow's house that night and in the days that followed, many members of the French opposition to Napoleon III, and also a stream of condolence messages from other organizations, students groups, workers, Masonic lodges, and individuals. Bigelow later wrote to a friend in New York, "I am quite sure that the death of no other foreign sovereign or subject, by whatever means, would have produced so much emotion. The Republicans here are taking advantage of this to keep the subject before the people as much as possible. The death of Lincoln, I think, is destined to work a radical change in the Constitution of France. In London, Karl Marx stood before the International Workers' Association, Working Men's Association, which had just organized the previous year, and read the letter that he had drafted to President Johnson expressing their sympathy. It is not our part to call words of sorrow and horror while the heart of two worlds heaves with emotion. Even the sycophants who year after year and day after day stick to their Sisyphus work of morally assassinating Abraham Lincoln and the great republic he headed stand now aghast at this universal outburst of popular feeling and rival with each other to strew rhetorical flowers on his open grave. Over 1,000 of these letters were translated and published as part of the annual diplomatic correspondence. And then they came out in later editions, expanded in 1866 and 67. They were sent to every government in the world and to every organization and individual that had issued a message. These were, by the way, 1,000 letters, but signed by tens and thousands of people in small villages and large cities, and citizens from all ranks of society. I found dozens of other letters that didn't make their way into this volume. Listen to this from the French radicals who were in exile in Belgium. They called themselves the refugees of '61. You possess that which all dream of, like France in '92 and '48, suppressing all distinctions of class, of caste, of birth, and race. You dare to make the broadest and only true application of the principle of equality. You, they're speaking to the whole American people, you have done more to reestablish the Union. You have done more than reestablish the Union of the American Republic. You have saved the holy ark of the liberties of the world. You, America, are now the cradle of the Universal Republic, a term that was attributed, of course, to France for many years since 1789. Karl Marx expressed similar hopes just a few months earlier in a letter congratulating Lincoln for his re-election. The working men of Europe consider it an earnest of the epoch, a down payment on the epoch to come, that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world. It's to that reconstruction of the social world that I want to turn now. Between 1865 and 1871, there were three major results of this international reconstruction, as I call it. First was the end of slavery in the Americas, a long, slow death, as I'll explain, but nonetheless, the end of slavery. Second, the withdrawal of European empires from the Western Hemisphere. And third, a flurry of revolutions, civil wars, and reforms, sustaining the spread of republican institutions in the Euro-American world. Let me turn to slavery first. The US President of Emancipation, total, without compensation, and immediate emancipation, an emancipation that affected 2/3 of all the slaves, African slaves, in the American hemisphere, constituted a severe blow to the future of slavery in its remaining bastions in the Spanish Caribbean and the Empire of Brazil. More than just an example and influence, beginning in 1862, US foreign policy made anti-slavery a central part of its main thrust, and that came with the passage of the Lyons-Seward Treaty, in which the US essentially joined forces with Britain and promised to suppress the remaining illegal stream of trade from Africa to the New World of slaves. William Seward's successor, Hamilton Fish, Secretary of State under President Grant, shared some of Seward's racial prejudice and caution toward radical Reconstruction and full racial equality. But like Seward, he was strongly anti-slavery. When Spain invited the United States to mediate peace with Cuban rebels in 1869, Fish made the abolition of slavery a non-negotiable basis for peace. Cuban rebels, they rose up, remember in October 1868, the beginning of what we would later call the 10 Years' War, a failed revolution for independence and also for abolition. When they rose up in October 1868, they were very eager to win US aid, and many of them also were eager to be annexed into the United States. They realized they could not win over the Spanish alone, and many of them wanted to join the United States for the future. They raised the banner of emancipation and invited enslaved men and women to join the Mombi Army, as it was known. Many came to fight bearing images of Abraham Lincoln, the Gran Emancipador, an image that could be found years later in shanties and the mansions of wealthy liberals in Cuba. At Guaymaro in April 1869, the revolutionary government promulgated a Republican Constitution, all of this in an effort to win US support. And in that, they inscribed the immediate abolition of slavery and the enfranchisement of former slaves, all Cubans, as equals under the law. The Guaymaro delegates also agreed to draft what they called an exposition to President Grant, making the case for US support and eventual annexation. In order for them to join what one called the splendid American constellation. And also what they did was to replace the original revolutionary banner with the flag, the national flag, that Narciso Lopez had led his filibustering expedition back in 1851 to Cuba from New Orleans. So this is another signal of their affinity for the United States and for annexation. That same flag, by the way, flies over Cuba to this day. Spain, this gets complicated, was undergoing a simultaneous revolution. In the fall of 1868, a junta of Spanish liberals overthrew the sclerotic Bourbon monarchy and sent Queen Isabella II into exile in France. The next summer, the Spanish Cortes answered the Cuban rebels, actually it's the summer of 1870, excuse me, with their own far more aggressive, far more conservative plan for ending slavery. During the debates, one of the Spanish abolitionists, Emilio Castelar, a historian, history professor, an ardent Republican, a zealous abolitionist, and a huge admirer of Lincoln. He had a statuette of Lincoln on his desk and later wrote an effusive eulogy to Lincoln. Castelar stood before the Cortes and gave a really magnificent oration. It lasted all afternoon, opposing gradual emancipation, which was on the table being considered, with an amendment that called for full, immediate, uncompensated abolition on the American model. Castelar presented US Reconstruction as a model for Spain. And this is interesting. A lot of people idealize what was going on in America from a distance, of course, without knowing everything that was going on. But listen to Castelar. Having converted its slaves into men, the Americans have devoted themselves to turning those men into citizens. Today, gentlemen, those beings who were formerly not even men are freer than the first of the sons of Europe. Those men who were like beasts of burden, wretched as the reptiles that crawled among the cotton and the cane, are free men, are American citizens. They sit in Congress and the Senate of Washington. Castellar's speech went on for hours, but he failed to win the day. His adversary, Sigismundo Marais, answered that, quote, the great Lincoln did not want to abolish slavery until 1900. Marais also rebuked those reactionaries who wanted to defend Cuban slavery. This would throw the rebels into the arms of the Americans, of the United States. Spain must say to the world, Marais argued, we give you definite proof. Here is the project. Slavery is dead and finished forever in Spanish dominions. Well, not quite dead. It would die a slow death. According to the Marais Law, it was called a free womb law, and it meant that the children of those born after the law was published, this was a significant phrase, as it turned out, because it wasn't published in Cuba for several years. It meant that all slaves who fought with Spain with the loyal forces in Cuba would win their freedom, that all those over the age of 60 or 65, it was modified, and all those born after September 17, 1868, the next day was the revolution, and so all of them would be free. The Marais Law was passed on July 4th, 1870, perhaps daring the United States to repudiate this gesture toward abolition, which was the condition for peace in Cuba. Hamilton Fish saw the Marais Law for exactly what it was, a sham, a project, he said, for relieving the slave owners from the necessity of supporting infants and aged slaves and prolonging the institution as to able-bodied slaves. It would be another 40 to 50 years before slavery ended in the Spanish Caribbean, according to the Marais Law. Now, at the same time, neither Fish nor the US Congress wanted to annex Cuba. They could not really intervene on behalf of the rebellion without violating their own foreign policy during the Civil War, when they warned Britain and France to stay out of this domestic affair, that this was a rebellion, a domestic insurrection, and we will wrap the world in flames if you interfere. Remember also that the US was preparing a suit against Britain, known as the Alabama claims, and they could hardly present that with credibility and at the same time intervene on behalf of the rebels in Cuba. But more than that, they did not want another war-torn society, and in addition to racial prejudice, there was also, and Fish enunciated this clearly in his correspondence, a real concern about trying to digest, trying to assimilate a Catholic, Spanish-speaking, mixed race people into the United States. So that was the other side of Reconstruction, wasn't it? Racial prejudice and just a concern that America had its plate full. I'm running out of time already. Turning to another very important yet strangely neglected aspect of this international reconstruction was the rapid decolonization of the American hemisphere. Within a few weeks, in the spring of 1867, Russia, Britain, France were all withdrew from the Western Hemisphere. You know the story about Russia. Seward purchased it, but it also had the effect of putting pressure on the British to do something about Canada. Some said that the purchase of Alaska put British Columbia, an important part of Canada, between two jaws, like a sandwich between two jaws of the United States. The British leaders were already vexed by these Fenian raids of Irish American, mostly Union veterans, who had used the Civil War as a kind of training means to strike for republicanism in Ireland and, of course, independence from Britain. Seward did very little to stop these raids, and though they were not able as they intended to ignite war between Britain and the United States, they nonetheless proved that this was a very porous border and the British had to do something about it. They had already been working on the creation of a confederation that they dubbed the Dominion of Canada. And it was essentially a self-governing and, most important, a self-defending quasi-republic. The British effectively withdrew on July 1st, 1867. Now, the French retreat from Mexico was not peaceful nor easy, and their US intervention was also threatened. Ulysses S. Grant, in collaboration with Matias Romero, the Mexican ambassador, sent 50,000 men to the border under Phil Sheridan and menaced the French who were coming to the border. Maximilian, in the meantime, was inviting Confederate exiles to come into Mexico and permitted them to bring slaves. He didn't call it slavery, but it was an apprentice system that allowed slavery in all but name. Grant wanted that refugee stream to be stopped, and they made anti-slavery a powerful part of US foreign policy. Grant was concerned that the Confederates would continue to carry on a revanchist war from across the border. France, under growing pressure from the US abroad and from the French opposition at home, finally announced in January of 1866 that the French civilizing mission in Mexico had come to its end. It was not until March 1867, however, that the French finally left in a rather hasty retreat from Veracruz and came back to more troubles in their homeland in France. So the slow death of slavery in the Americas and the sudden decolonization of the American hemisphere was finished business. Whether or not this was Lincoln's vision or not, it was very much part of US foreign policy to prevent future problems by, during the war they had been surrounded by unfriendly, if not hostile enemies of republicanism and of the United States, the Confederacy, Britain, and France, and they wanted to bring that to an end. And also, one of the other aims of Reconstruction at home and abroad was to end slavery, seeing that as hostile and inimical to Republican ideals, but also to US interests. And if those were accomplished in this time, the struggle for liberty, equality, and self-rule were far from over.
Next, we have Professor William Lasser, who's speaking on Abraham Lincoln, national sovereignty, and the growth of the European Union. Dr. Lasser is alumni distinguished professor of political science here at Clemson. He's also the director of the Calhoun Honors College. He's the author of a number of books on law and American politics, including The Limits of Judicial Power, the Supreme Court, and American Politics.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. And I'd like to also express my thanks to Vernon and Peter for putting this conference together and for allowing a political scientist to interlope. And I will try to stay with our time limit. Is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness, as President Lincoln in his July 4th, 1861 message to Congress? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? Lincoln's message, and more importantly, his actions before and after that message, answered that question, at least in the American context. In waging the war, Lincoln stretched both presidential and national power to its breaking point. Often acting without congressional authorization, he blockaded the southern ports, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, ignored the Supreme Court of the United States, initially at least raised an army, and ultimately began the process of freeing the slaves and saving the Union. Much canon has been said about Lincoln's words and actions during the war, and I hesitate to say any more in this company. My focus instead will be on the American constitutional regime and particularly on the nature of American federalism, asking the question, what was it about the American regime that gave Lincoln the space and the systematic capacity to save the Union as he did? And then to ask whether there are lessons in that first question for the European Union. This work is part of a larger project on the United States and the EU, undertaken in collaboration with my colleague Bertha Wassenberg, who's professor of contemporary history at the University of Strasbourg. This work, as I say, reflects her work as well. The American experience is often considered to be not very relevant to Europe, and yet I would quote Alexis de Tocqueville, the author who is most identified with what is known as American exceptionalism, who stressed the importance of this comparative approach. "I did not study America just to satisfy curiosity, however legitimate," he wrote in his preface to Democracy in America. He said, "I sought lessons there from which we," and by we he meant Europe, "might profit." But perhaps a more significant reason to look at the American comparison that I propose is that in its early years, the United States faced many of the same issues and obstacles that currently face Europe. Questions about the nature of sovereignty, the division of power between the Union and its constituent parts, and the legitimacy of democratic politics in a federalist system. And it is to those issues that I now turn. I want to begin with the question of sovereignty, the absolute and perpetual power vested in a commonwealth. The American anti-federalists took the position that was historically well known. Namely, as Hobbes said, what is it to divide the power of a commonwealth but to dissolve it? The American anti-federalists throughout the constitutional debates proposed that either the United States could either be a firm league of friendship established among sovereign states, or it could be a consolidated union. There was no middle ground. The Federalists, by contrast, rejected this all-or-nothing approach. Instead of being a purely national or purely federal form of government, the United States, they argued, was a unique combination of the two. Against the charge that the Constitution would create a consolidation of the states, Madison counted the many ways in which the United States proposed government would in fact be one that respected the sovereignty of the states. For example, in the matter of its ratification by the people in the states, in the representation of the states in the Senate, and, of course, in the state's role in the amendments process. He even acknowledged in what became known as the principle of dual sovereignty, that the jurisdiction of the national government extends to certain enumerated objects only and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all the other objects. Now, such divided sovereignty is possible, of course, because of the idea of sovereignty of the people. And I won't dwell on things that are well known, but I want to stress how extraordinary it was that this fundamental question of sovereignty was simply not resolved during the American constitutional debates. As one scholar concluded with some understatement nearly a century ago, the doctrine of sovereignty became part of the original Constitution at the time of its adoption in 1789, but its scope and meaning were not then clear and well defined. To put it more bluntly, both sides emerged from the ratification process with their ideas and principles intact. The anti-federalist, writes one historian, while losers in 1788 were neither liquidated nor forced to flee, nor, more significantly, were their ideas extinguished. No one paradigm cleared the field in 1789 and obtained exclusive dominance in the American political system. Now, we know some of the reasons for this. The Federalists deliberately obscured their position for political reasons. But even during the course of the ratification debates, the Federalists, many went so far as to essentially agree with the anti-federalists, diminishing the idea that the United States federal system would touch the sovereignty of the states. All rights in the Constitution are declared to be completely vested in the people, unless expressly given away, said one anti-federalist. Can there be a more pointed or positive reservation of power? Although the Constitution did not contain the words expressly delegated, this argument seemed to declare that omission of no importance. In the Virginia ratifying debates, George Nicholas, for example, stressed that the Constitution was a contract. He was a Federalist with this, among the states. The confusion about the nature of the Federalist position was further went further to include the addition of the Bill of Rights to the original document, one of which rights eventually became the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Madison himself came around to the position that the first 10 amendments should be included in the Constitution and pointed himself to the 10th Amendment as being of particular importance, although later Federalists would insist that this language was a mere truism. Again, one finds the anti-Federalist position emerging from the constitutional debate intact. And indeed, during the second Washington administration, during the Kentucky and Virginia resolution episode, the idea of nullification is first proposed, and is proposed explicitly on the grounds that the Constitution, according to these anti-Federalists or late anti-Federalists, is a compact each state acceded to as a state and is an integral party. The resolutions have been denounced by critics then and now, and it's certainly true that John C. Calhoun, for example, picked up on this idea of nullification, which originally is proposed there, and that this doctrine helped inflame the Civil War crisis. But it's also true that all the elements of Calhoun's position and of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were openly discussed during the ratification debates themselves, and not always rejected by the Federalists. Now, Calhoun went back, as I said, to this position and carried forth the idea that not only could states nullify acts of Congress, but indeed they could secede from the Union if they chose to do so. The idea of secession had been brought up as early as the War of 1812 by the New Englanders at the Hartford Convention, but Calhoun went further, writing, "Hapless would be the condition of the states if their only alternative lay between submission to a government of self-construed, or in other words, unlimited powers, and the certainty of coercion in case of withdrawal by force of arms. The way to escape was the acknowledged right of secession." It's important to understand that to the Southerners, at least, secession was not illegal, or not clearly illegal. They insisted it was justified under the constitutional provision. Now, Europe's discussion, well, and I should just add that, of course, you all know Lincoln rejected that position 180 degrees. But Europe's discussion of sovereignty has followed a very different path. In the treaties that originally created the European Union, beginning in 1950 with the European Coal and Steel Treaty, there was, as in the US Constitution, no explicit discussion of withdrawal and no clear picture of sovereignty. Yet the EU First Treaty and all the treaties really come in the form of treaties, which suggests that they are made as a compact between member states. And yet the 1957 Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, states that the treaty was concluded for, quote, an unlimited period. And it did not contain an explicit right of withdrawal from the European community. The Treaty of Rome also lacked a supremacy clause, although the European Court of Justice has later added one. The EU treaties were not, yet people who tried to suggest that the EU project was more than simply an agreement among states tried to suggest that this early treaties and the developing treaties would eventually lead to something beyond this mere treaty, mere compact among nations. As one legal scholar put it in the 1990s, they created, at least in theory, a legal system separate from that of the member states, but nevertheless intimately and even organically tied to it. In practical terms, however, it was clear from the beginning that any member state could leave the European Union. And indeed, in 1984, when Greenland was given more or less its independence, it wanted to withdraw from the European community, and it was allowed to do so with, of course, a treaty change. 2 decades later, when the Europeans proposed their Constitution for Europe, they included in it, for the first time, an explicit withdrawal clause, which then, after the rejection of the European Constitution, or the Constitution for Europe, gets reused as Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon. The author of Article 50, who was an English diplomat, said that he added that theory because there were Eurosceptics who believed that the Constitution for Europe would prevent the right of withdrawal. And he said that was a ridiculous idea, and so why not put it in the idea there that you could withdraw if you wanted to. He said he never thought that England would be the first, or UK would be the first country to use his language. Now, this ambiguity in the constitutional meaning, I think, is critical to American political development and critical to Lincoln's success in saving the Union during the Civil War. And I won't spend a great deal of time on it, and I'm trying to stay within my time, and so I'm losing my slides here. But I'll skip very quickly over other aspects of the American Constitution, which are similarly unclear in their meaning. One is, of course, the power of the presidency, which Lincoln takes full advantage of. The Federalists know that the Anti-Federalists are worried about a new kind of monarchy for America, and so they downplay the nature of executive power. I'll give you just one quote. Hamilton, noting that the British monarchy had not used the veto power since the reign of Queen Anne, asked, quote, "If a magistrate so powerful and so well fortified as a British monarch would have scruples about the exercise of power under consideration, the veto power, how much greater caution may reasonably be expected in a president of the United States, clothed for the short period of 4 years with the executive authority of a government wholly and purely Republican?" Presidential powers were granted in broad terms, but they were also granted in extraordinarily ambiguous terms. And indeed, there were even ambiguities about those aspects of American power that were more widely agreed upon. For example, in the case of the courts, it was most likely agreed upon in the founding period that there would be, the court would have the power to enforce the Constitution. What was unclear was whether it would be able to enforce that against the states, or even more importantly, whether it would have the final say vis-a-vis the states. And so all of this, and it was unclear just how broad Congress's power would be. And if there is, certainly both Federalists and Anti-Federalists wanted to strengthen national power and congressional power under the Constitution. But if there was any question as to whether those mark the limits of legislative power were marked very clearly, that would have been erased almost immediately by the controversy over the Bank of the United States during the very first years of the Washington administration. My phone is not letting me tell the time, I'm sorry. Okay, all right. So I will get to sort of my final points here. What this meant is two things that I think are of critical importance. The first one is that every institution of the United States government was established with a certain amount with such a degree of ambiguity in its powers that particularly in times of crisis, those powers could be stretched. Lincoln does this explicitly. Jackson had done it before. Presidents have done it ever since. Emergency does not create power, said Justice Robert Jackson much later, but it may provide the opportunity for the exercise of power. And secondly, it meant the structure of the American system meant that the questions about national versus state power were fought about on the playing field of national politics. And this has to do, too, with the structure of the American early party system and with the fact that American elections were nationalized these concerns. And so even someone as anti-federalist as Calhoun, of course, begins his political career no place other than Washington, and early on fights for example, for the powers of the Bank of the United States. Now, of that is different in Europe. And I think that the decisions that were made in Europe under similar circumstances, I should say we think, because here I rely on my colleague to a great extent, those decisions could have been decided differently. The European project was founded on three principles that are quite different from those that mark the American Constitution. Although the Europeans aimed to lay the foundations of what they called an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, they were absolutely dedicated to restricting any notion that sovereignty would be fully shared, even shared at all, with the European Union. As I said, this was seen already in the process of treaty law rather than constitution making. And then I think it became worse when the Constitution for Europe failed in the early 2000s, because it revealed that possibility, direct attempt to restrict the sovereignty of the nation states would not be feasible. The battle for the Constitution of Europe, similar to the ratification process here, was on a country-by-country basis, but importantly, it required unanimity among those who were already members of the European community. And once it was rejected by voters in France and the Netherlands, the European Constitution project was dead. Now, this ever closer union was to be created through a process known as functionalism. And functionalism was the idea that cooperation in specific narrow policy areas would foster greater would foster cooperation in other policy areas, and then would foster wider political integration. I think that process, though, was ultimately successful in creating very broad swaths of what the Europeans call competencies of power within the European Union, but they have the result in American terms of suggesting that the only powers that the European Union has are those that are expressly delegated, to use the anti-federalist terminology. There's very little room for the European Union to stretch its muscles when, for example, common security and defense policy is expressly reserved to the member states and can only be operationalized through the Council of Europe, through the European Council, I always get those two mixed up, which is the presidents and prime ministers of the member states. I've already suggested that the lack of agreement on basic constitutional principles, whether by happenstance or design, was critical to both the creation of and the resolution of the Civil War crisis. The lack of clear answers on these important questions likely delayed the secession crisis because it gave both sides on the slavery question room to maneuver. It also helped to legitimize, unfortunately, the fight against slavery because it permitted the South, Calhoun in particular, to frame the question, not as a question of defending slavery solely, although he did that too, but primarily to this day, unfortunately, as a question of states' rights. In fact, the importance of Dred Scott, I think in the political terms, was precisely that it narrowed this area of constitutional ambiguity and thus provided less room for both sides to maneuver, and hence triggered the war. Lincoln also benefited, as I've suggested, from the lack of specificity on the nature of both legislative and executive power, something well known to everyone in this room, and from even not just the presidential power, but congressional power as well. Europe's crises over the past 2 decades have not been nearly as dramatic and are unlikely to end in war. After all, the purpose of the European Union was explicitly to prevent war, so it would seem very unlikely that any European leader could literally go to war to save it. But I want to come back to the question I started with, that Lincoln posed in 1861. Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its people or too weak to maintain its own existence? Because I think that is the question that currently faces the European Union. Fear of the consolidation of power at the European Union level led its founders to place strict limits on the exercise of power in Brussels, particularly in matters of budgetary and defense policy. And it's no surprise that the crisis of the European Union has come over questions of finance and budgets and over the migrant question, defending the European border in that sense. The definition of sovereignty as being lodged in the member states and not in the European Union, at least even in some sense, along with a tremendous fragmentation of executive power, which is lodged in many, many different agencies and individuals, has choked off the development of a robust political space in Europe at the EU level. This means that the questions of most importance to European voters, economic policy in Greece, for example, or migration policy in Britain, have no choice but to fight their battles at the national level, because those questions in Europe are influenced only through their national leadership in the European Council. And therefore, this strengthens the centrifugal forces that tend to tear federal systems apart. In the European Union, there is no Lincoln, nor at this time any possibility of a Lincoln to emerge who can respond to these crises by stretching the powers of the Union or to rally the people of Europe behind its cause. Thank you.
Our last speaker this afternoon is Joshua Catalano. He's speaking on From Ken Burns, the Civil War, to History's Ancient Aliens, Lincoln's Unfinished Work on Cable Television. Professor Catalano is a lecturer in the history department here at Clemson and a doctoral candidate in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University. His research interests include Revolutionary America, Native American history, memory, digital history, and public history.
I'd like to thank Vernon, Peter, and everybody who helped organize this conference. I saw all the hard work, energy, and sweat firsthand that went into pulling this off, so I'd like to thank you. I'd also like to take a brief moment to recognize where we are today. Not only are we on the former plantation of John C. Calhoun, but we are also on Cherokee land. My presentation today is titled From Ken Burns' The Civil War to History's Ancient Aliens, Lincoln's Unfinished Work on Cable Television. This is part of an ongoing research project with my colleague, Brianna Pokratsky, who's a doctoral candidate in sociology at George Mason University. Nearly 2 decades ago, Gary Edgerton made the bold claim that television is the principal means by which most people learn about history today. As a 10-year-old elementary school student in a rural town far away from any college, university, or museum, this was definitely true for me. Despite the continued popularity of museums and online resources, this assertion remains largely true. However, the historical programming now presented on television is no longer dominated by the biographies of decades past. While PBS and a few other outlets continue to produce educational programming that focuses on historical content rooted in archival research and scholarly expertise, other networks, such as History, formerly the History Channel, have shifted to more financially profitable programming that is only loosely based on historical content and gives little regard to the topical representativeness and nuanced interpretation. While History is not the only scholastic television network to move away from research-based educational programming, its authoritative presence makes this shift deeply concerning. Scholars have argued that film and television, and by extension history and its programming, plays an important role in historical knowledge production and the present shaping of collective memory, especially in relationship to how audiences engage with historical content in everyday life. As Marais Law theorized, all memories are collective. Even personal memories can only be understood as occurring in our relationships to various collective milieus. Thus, remembering is more than an isolated biological phenomenon whereby a previous experience is simply brought back into one's consciousness. Rather, it is a reconstruction of the past, shaped by different social frameworks. One of today's most influential social frameworks is television. If history is in fact transgressing the boundary of infotainment and is directly impacting our social frameworks, what kind of discourses are circulating on the channel? What does that mean for audiences who are consuming content from sources they view as authoritative? This paper explores how history assigns value and legitimizes certain methodologies, ideas, and identities. Using distant reading and close textual analysis of 30 consecutive days of history's programming, we argue that the majority of the network's aired programming is reality television in the guise of historical content. Not only has history fully embraced reality television, it is profiting off of a problematic orientation to the factual and evidence-based framework that humanistic and scientific inquiry is built upon. Finally, we argue that history supplements its conspiratorial programming with shows that reproduce a narrow conception of blue-collar masculinity that emphasizes men, whiteness, patriotism, and the mythic frontier situated within a capitalist framework. By entangling a strong masculinity narrative with a nostalgic, decontextualized, and capitalistic understanding of the American dream, history caters to an older, predominantly white male demographic and offers programming that aligns with and legitimizes this worldview. Following the success of Ken Burns' The Civil War in 1990, cable companies looked to take advantage of a new market for entertaining and informative programming. In 1995, A&E launched the History Channel. With successful and informative shows and miniseries such as Modern Marvels, The Presidents, The American Revolution, Civil War Journal, and a variety of other documentary-style programming, the History Channel as a brand name developed an authoritative credibility among audiences. History's authoritative presence has been reinforced through educational partnerships, such as History in the Classroom, its financial support for the National Council of Public History, and the airing of its programming in museums across the country, many of which are operated by the National Park Service. While history continues to enjoy significant amounts of intellectual credibility among audiences, the quality of the content and its programming has changed significantly. With the success of shows such as History's Mysteries, UFO Files, Conspiracy, Wild West Tech, and Mail Call, the network found an audience for both conspiratorial and non-traditional historical programming. Building off of its own growing audience and catering to changing tastes, the History Channel entered the reality TV market in 2007 with Ice Road Truckers, a reality television series about truck drivers who navigate dangerous driving conditions. The success of Ice Road Truckers resulted in the History Channel moving further into entertainment programming, and specifically reality television shows that featured gritty jobs, dangerous conditions, and the wilds of nature. Soon after the premiere of Ice Road Truckers, the History Channel rebranded itself in 2008. The slogan changed from the History Channel, where the past comes alive, to History Made Every Day. What followed was more reality television programming, which centered on what can be categorized as blue-collar work, with Axemen 2008, Swamp People 2010, American Restoration 2010, American Pickers 2010, Mountain Men 2012, and Appalachian Outlaws 2014. This programming centers on a narrow understanding of masculinity that legitimates whiteness, maleness, and morality situated within an industrial economy. These shows construct authentic masculinity as involving physical force and control, occupational achievement, familial patriarchy, frontiersmanship, and heterosexuality. According to Brian Stelter in 2011, ratings showed that History attracted more middle-aged men than any other cable channel except ESPN. Among all primetime viewers, the History Channel was number 5 on cable. So a little bit about our methods. This paper employs a mixed method and interdisciplinary approach to analyze 30 consecutive days of 2018 programming aired on History. To critically understand the themes and messages of History's programming, both in aggregate and as individual shows, we supplemented a close reading analysis with topic models generated from the titles and descriptions of the episodes. Topic modeling is a method of computational analysis, often referred to as distant reading, that uses word co-occurrences to analyze themes or topics in a text corpus. From the corpus, the model generates a specified number of topics based on word co-occurrences and provides a breakdown of what each topic is contained within a particular text, or in this case, episode title and description. So this requires us to make 2 assumptions to understand topic models. The first is that we assume that words that appear frequently together, they co-occur in text, have some sort of meaningful relationship. We group those into topics. The second assumption we make is that any document, whether it's a book, in this case an episode description, is comprised in some combination of those said topics. And this is essentially how the underlying structure of a topic model works. In this way, the themes of History's programming across shows can be seen in aggregate. To improve the output of the model, we removed duplicated episodes and pruned the vocabulary, omitting proper names and other words that were so unique to the corpus that they skewed the model. Together, these two methods provide a richer analysis of discourse production on the network. The results of the topic model showed a general lack of historical themes. This slide depicts a topic model with 12 topics and displays the top 20 most significant words associated with each topic, going from the most important at the top to the least important at the bottom. Based on the content or words of each topic, we assign labels to each. So topic models are generated organically from the text. They don't come predetermined with labels. We don't filter it through and say, identify what's about the Civil War. It's going to organically bring that up. So originally, it doesn't have labels. We assigned labels based on the clusters of words. These included apocalyptic prophecy, treasure hunting, bladesmithing, collecting, space and technology, competition, killing, collecting, American military, a mixed category, aliens, classic cars, and capitalism, on a channel about history. As this topic model shows, the themes of history's programming have very little to do with history as it is traditionally understood. To gain an understanding of the overall prevalence or frequency of these topics on history, not just their mere existence or inclusion in the topic model, we counted the number of times a particular word appeared in an episode title or description. This bar chart shows the most common words included in the episode descriptions in the sample. The most frequently used words were ancient, old, world, rare, collection, final, car, war, fire, history, take, offer, and gets. In total, we examined 906 programs that were aired over this 30-day period. We then filtered it to the 511 unique episodes that were aired. Many of these words are more associated with specific topics. For example, the word ancient appears in the description of nearly every episode of Ancient Aliens, as did the words fire and final in the show Forged in Fire. And the names of the shows were not included in this text corpus. Other words related to the themes of capitalism and collecting, such as buy, take, offer, car, and get. These are associated with several shows such as Pawn Stars, American Pickers, and Counting Cars, among others. After examining the models, we performed a close contextual analysis of several episodes of the most frequently aired programs. As shown in the slide, the most frequently aired shows were Pawn Stars, American Pickers, Forged in Fire, Ancient Aliens, Six, and Counting Cars. The close reading of these shows revealed not only the themes of capitalism and conspiracy, but an underlying thread of masculinity. Capitalism, tied to blue-collar conceptions of work, was the most prominent theme in the sample and wove many of these topics together. History has continued its emphasis on capitalism with programming such as The Men Who Built America, which focuses on titans of industry such as Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford. And Pawn Stars, which aired 153 times, and American Pickers, which aired 147 times. Pawn Stars, if you're not familiar with it, is a reality television show program that features the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas. And it follows 3 generations of the Harrison family as they jointly run the family business. They are depicted as no-nonsense, well-networked experts who are always concerned with making a profit. In the opening of Pawn Stars, Rick Harrison states, quote, "At my shop, family comes first and money comes second, depending on who you ask." In a recent interview with Fox News, Rick Harrison stated that capitalism is, quote, "the survival of the fittest, and that in the end, everyone has a better life because of it." Harrison used the interview as an opportunity to promote libertarianism, his support of Donald Trump, and his personal success story in relation to the American dream. Harrison noted his lower middle-class background, his self-education, and his father's strong work ethic, meanwhile condemning government regulation and socialism. The second most aired show, American Pickers, also highlights history's construction of masculinity and strongly ties to the topics of collecting and treasure hunting. American Pickers, which premiered in 2010, is a reality television show that features 2 Midwesterners, Mike Wolf and Frank Fritz, as they travel rural U.S. in search for Americana to restore and resell at their antique shops. Mike and Frank present themselves as intelligent but approachable guys who wear basic t-shirts and worn and blue jeans and appear to embrace the hunt for mantiques and what they signify, no matter how dirty or sweaty the hunt may be. History's description of the show begins with, "This isn't your grandmother's antiquing show," and states that Mike and Frank are on a mission to recycle America, even if it means diving into countless piles of grimy junk or getting chased off a gun-wielding homeowner's land. On the show, Mike and Frank are usually in search of vintage cars, motorcycles, bikes, oil cans, signage, and memorabilia tied to U.S. patriotism and industrial labor. Coming in a distant third for the most aired programming on history was the reality television competition Forged in Fire, with 50 episodes. Its sub-series, Forged in Fire Cutting Deeper, 19 episodes, and another sub-series, Knife or Death, 11 episodes. Forged in Fire adds to the construction of masculinity on history and includes topics such as competition killing, capitalism, and bladesmithing. In the show, bladesmiths forge iconic weapons from metal. Their weapons are judged by a panel of experts who determine the winner of $10,000. The forge itself evokes imagery of gritty, sweaty, and tiresome work in the US popular imagination. Contestants on the show, often men, are featured fanatically heating, hammering, pressing, and grinding steel as sweat drips off their faces in front of a glowing fire. Judges test the strength and sharpness of their weapons, in addition to a final kill test, involving animal carcasses and ballistic dummies. Brandon Weigel explains that this show is a callback to our country's height as an industrial powerhouse, when red-blooded American men could make a good living using their hands, and so much of what we bought proudly said, made in the USA. Related to these themes of capitalism and masculinity were a number of other programs. History has had a successful run of programs that mix elements of survival, occupational hazards, and capitalism. Swamp People, 36 episodes, Swamp People Blood and Guts, 8 episodes, were the most played occupational programming during the sample period. Swamp People is an occupational reality television show series that follows alligator hunters, primarily in Louisiana, on their quest to find, kill, and sell alligators. While Swamp People dominated the number of episodes aired in this genre during the sample, it has previously shared this genre with Appalachian Outlaws, Axemen, Ice Road Truckers, and Mountain Men. Another popular category of programming focused on automobiles, with shows such as Counting Cars, 36, Top Gear 6, Truck Night in America, 2. With these shows, history is contributing to a larger theme of nostalgia for old objects and ideas. History's recent production of scripted dramas also appear in the sample with the program 6, which depicts the lives of Navy SEAL Team 6 members both at home and abroad. This is building off their previous success of a series called Vikings. The final prominent theme in the topic in the model consisted of aliens, prophecies, and speculative content. Ancient Aliens, 49 episodes, was the most frequently aired and emblematic program of this topic in the sample. History describes the show in the following way. Ancient Aliens explores the controversial theory that extraterrestrials have visited Earth for millions of years, from the age of the dinosaurs to ancient Egypt, from early cave drawings to continued mass sightings in the US. Each episode in this hit history series gives historic depth to the questions, speculations, provocative controversies, first-hand accounts, and grounded theories surrounding this age-old debate. Did intelligent beings from outer space visit Earth thousands of years ago? The premise of Ancient Aliens is anything but novel. Rather, it is part of a long tradition of alternative archaeology, or pseudo-archaeology. This fascination with the possibility of extraterrestrial ancestors can be traced back to the Victorian era and the early 20th century works of H.P. Lovecraft. As Jeb Karb points out, by the 1920s, many of the topics and theories of modern archaeology and pseudo-archaeology were already present, including giants, ancient space travelers, magic as occult science and wisdom, druids, megaliths, a high-handed disdain for foolish materialist scientists and benighted religious leaders. These themes can be seen in the questions posed by Ancient Aliens. Each episode of Ancient Aliens consists of a carefully selected group of what are called ancient astronaut theorists, who attempt to explain historical and archaeological questions about ancient civilizations through past visitation of extraterrestrial beings. The lack of credentialed and respected archaeologists on the show is a hallmark of pseudo-archaeology. Through the examination of actual archaeological sites and artifacts, these ancient astronaut theorists attempt to bring credibility to their often unsupported, fantastical, and extraterrestrial explanations. By continuously posing often unanswerable questions without any conclusive answers and cherry-picking evidence, the show erodes the basis for proof and understanding that scientific and humanistic inquiry are founded upon, thus promoting the acceptance of highly unlikely and unsupported theories as legitimate possibilities. The testimony of ancient alien astronaut theorists and their ideas is constructed as just as legitimate as that of professional archaeologists and their peer-reviewed research. In some respects, the ancient astronaut theorists are presented as more legitimate because of the lack of academic training, which would have blinded their eyes from seeing the bigger picture. As Card points out, the one unifying theme of alternative archaeology is its opposition to professional mainstream archaeology and more broadly science. By providing adherents to alternative archaeology or pseudo-archaeology with a platform to promote their ideas, history legitimizes their perspectives and threatens to undermine or delegitimize the research methods and conclusions of professional archaeologists. As Parker argues, even if audiences grasp the inauthenticity of such programs, it does not diminish many of the negative externalities generated by the scientific claims made by the hosts. Even the Smithsonian has taken notice. In a review of Ancient Aliens, Brian Switek opines that what results is a slimy and incomprehensible mixture of idle speculation and outright fabrications, which pit the enthusiastic ancient alien theorist, as the narrator generously calls them, against mainstream science. Alternative archaeology has already contributed to a proliferation of conspiracy theories and the undermining of scientific truth. Conspiracy theorists such as Alex Jones and Jim Marrs cite Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu as inspiration for their work. As Card cautions, alternative archaeology can be a major vector for spreading old racist ideologies into the present. With this changing economic environment, history found the construction of ambiguous, unresolved narratives to be a profitable endeavor, with shows such as Ancient Aliens, Haunted History, History's Mysteries, UFO Files, Conspiracy, Monster Quest, The Nostradamus Effect, and Decoding the Past, among others. More ridiculous quotes. The themes that weave all of history programming together in a sample are conspiracies, capitalism, and masculinity. These topics are overrepresented on history. Largely absent from history's themes are the discussions of race, slavery, class, women's rights, neocolonialism, politics, LGBTQ history, and nearly all other topical foci of the modern history discipline. Only military history remains as a prominent theme in the sample. History has recently chosen to ignore subjects and topics that are connected with specific dates. For example, the MLK Day lineups for 2017 and 2018 featured no content about the civil rights or Black history. None. However, history decided to fully embrace presentism and featured special programming concerning North Korea to coincide with Donald Trump's trip to South Korea. Given history's popularity, it's important for scholars of all disciplines to critically examine what messages are being sent and received through the seemingly authoritative medium of history and other cable networks such as the Discovery Channel, TLC, and National Geographic. There's an urgent need for scholars to pay close attention to the kind of programming on network television and streaming services in this increasingly diverse media environment. Couched in a historical period of divisive politics and alternative facts of the Trump administration, discourse production concerning conspiracy theories and white masculinity in history is of pressing importance. As the following description for the latest season of Swamp People shows, the themes of traditional blue-collar masculinity regarding the frontier, industry, familial patriarchy, and anxiety over changing society are not going anywhere. I'll leave you with this description. As the new alligator hunting season begins, the swampers' very way of life is under siege. Their alligator hunting industry is on the verge of collapse due to the lowest prices in history. Some buyers aren't purchasing anything this year, and there's talk that the wild alligator industry might disappear completely. Facing bigger obstacles than ever before, Troy calls a meeting of the patriarchs from the swamp's main gator families. Thank you. For those interested in accessing the code, it's available on my GitHub page if you want to access the code and run it and experiment.
We have a little bit of time for question and answers. Do you guys want to assume the stool, the ducking stool?
I'm just curious why the Spanish, the Cubans, would have flown the Lopez flag trying to impress the Lincoln administration or anyone connected with it, since Lopez was a pro-slavery filibuster and was considered to be, sort of the worst example, if you could, of Southern aggressiveness. Did they not get that history? It just struck me as completely weird.
Yes, it surprised me too. There was a heated debate about that. I I don't know the full intellectual history behind this, but I think it was clearly intended to appeal to a United States that now saw the South and the purpose of those earlier filibustering expeditions as now separated from slavery, and so that now it was, and Lopez, by the way, was himself a kind of international, he saw himself liberating Cuba from Spanish rule. He was, I believe, South American, I think from Argentina was in it. Venezuelan, that's right, yeah. In any case, he was not a Southerner, and but of course he had allies there. But it is a strange history. You're,
was from the Deep South.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Not even, except for a few from the
Yes. No, it's a bizarre episode in history, and but nonetheless, I think, yes, of course they knew the history. They were trying to rewrite that, I suppose.
At the end, you clump military history along with ancient aliens and the rest of that crowd. One of my medieval colleagues actually appeared on Ancient Aliens, and he would like to live that down. In that spirit, don't you mean war porn rather than military history?
To an extent, yes. History in the past has been thoroughly criticized for, when it does focus on military stuff, almost being celebratory Hitler history, almost always World War II. They have had some offshoot programs recently that have been pretty good, World War II in HD, Vietnam in HD, but those are few and far between. More often it's some sort of Hitler's mysterious mega weapons or something along those lines.
Almost always preferring description over analysis.
Yes, there's very little analysis ever. Beginning in this is a larger change that happens. Some of you have appeared on documentaries. Beginning right around like 2005, as the reality television phenomenon takes off, they even change who they bring on as experts. So they stop bringing Dr. Foner on and other individuals to speak about historical topics, give analysis. Instead, celebrities, politicians, and just charismatic individuals in general. They often also employ single historians that focus on every single topic, even if it's not in their specialty. H.W. Brands has appeared on every single period on history. He's become like their go-to historian to talk about whatever the subject is. So it's part of a larger trend of moving away from actual nuanced analysis.
Could I just add one thing to that? Yeah, the vice president of the History Channel once addressed some historians at one of the conventions, and she said that the script that they are waiting for, they can't wait to get, would be Rommel at Gettysburg. And that's what they wanted. But to your last comment, it's worth noting that Ken Burns used a Jefferson impersonator in his two segment series on Jefferson, always labeling him as a Jefferson historian. He used a children's biographer, labeling her Jefferson biographer, and that was done in the 1990s, yes. And it was done all the time. So I don't think this is any kind of post-2000 phenomenon. You again see people who know nothing about history dragged out on PBS all the time, and they tell the things of which they know very little, but they have the authoritative view that they're on PBS and therefore they must know something.
Yes, the trends that I was referring to mostly refer to the History Channel's produced documentaries, but yes, the documentaries widely use the term historian very loosely. Someone who's read a book on the subject is a historian. So it's a larger problem. And academic credentials, too, have changed, where instead of listing the institution where a historian was from, the books they'd written on the bottom when they appear on screen, it's now just historian.
Question for you. You mentioned white masculinity being emphasized on the History Channel. One thing I've noticed in the black community specifically, like documentaries like Hidden Colors and black masculinity being emphasized. For example, they say that the black feminist movement came out of black women not being accepted by the white feminist movement. And I'm a teacher myself, and I have to deal with students coming in with these facts from YouTube and documentaries that Abraham Lincoln was black, the first president of the United States was not George Washington, and this is like populating the landscape. Have you looked into that at all?
My colleague could speak better to this. She focuses on contemporary media and how it shapes people's understanding of the world from largely homogenous communities via the internet. YouTube is filled with conspiratorial historical documentaries that to an undergrad student appear real. It's filled with all types of nonsense, and there's really no mechanism for filtering it. Students have to be trained to be digital media critics to be able to carefully analyze and pull the stuff out. And this is some stuff that's professionally done. It's not just some guy in his garage filming this stuff. They've got full production quality, creating counter-narratives, neo-Confederate stuff. There's a lot of disturbing things out there. To broaden your point, cable television is on the larger decline. Its base now is largely middle-aged white folks. But even things like Netflix now allow you to choose what you want to watch. So you could watch Ken Burns' The Civil War, which is on Netflix, or you could watch Hitler's mega weapons or the secret Nazis in South America. So users now have the choice, more choice than they had before, to decide what historical content that they're going to choose. Those who ignore what's on cable television have other options, but those who don't have access to internet, often in rural locations, are forced to watch this programming if they want some sort of historical programming.
Just have a couple of comments based on what you said and Paul said. One is, I now feel more out of touch with popular culture than I have ever felt in my life. I didn't even have a clue that all of these things that you were saying were on. And I think I understand the results of the last election a lot better now. This is truly amazing. But the other thing I was going to say is that I don't know if any of you remember the very early days of the History Channel and how different it was. And one thing in particular was that vice president of the History Channel that you mentioned that addressed the OAH. She was a friend of mine in graduate school at the University of Virginia before she went on to this job. And in the very beginning, they had something called the History Channel on campus, Professor Profiles. Any of you remember these? And I'm sure it had nothing to do with my personal friendship with her, but they came and taped my class and ran this whole thing about me and my class. And they were doing this to a lot of historians. So it's just...
Yeah, history started. History,
yes, but yes, when there's a content-oriented thing, but they were going out and seeking out, professors around the country and featuring them. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, it no longer has the audience that it once had. But history, from its outset, was very interested in education. I can remember the history in the classroom. Periods where they had free cable into your classroom at like 9 in the morning, and we'd all gather to watch the television that they rolled in and hooked up to the cable to watch. Speaking to your other point, I've noticed this as someone who's come from a rural, white, working class family, that there is a large disconnect between the academic community at large about what people are actually consuming. We get stuck in our academic bubbles all the time, and we think everyone's looking at the same things that we do, and we think that they're on Twitter, and we think they're doing all the things that we're doing. And there's a lot of America that's doing all kinds of different things. I couldn't send an email that had an attachment from my house because the internet access is so bad. Youth growing up there are not watching YouTube. They're not watching Netflix because they can't get it.
Just one quick comment. Vernon and I tried to interest C-SPAN in covering this conference, and they said they really weren't interested. They've had enough stuff like this and that. And, I think I don't know that much about it, but it seems to me it's a real pity if conferences like this are not taped and disseminated over C-SPAN or PBS or things like that. And it seems to me there's a lack of interest in this type of historical production, and it's unfortunate.
Let me just clarify. That's not quite right, Pete. The C-SPAN people contacted me. The people there wanted to come. Actually, the C-SPAN people who do it, they had heard about it. They wanted to come. They had to get approval higher up, and they came back and said, "Well, we have taped most of these people before." And not that they were doing something totally different, but that was the reasoning that the higher administration, not the actual people who like to do it, and they initiated wanting to come. Let me take this to my higher people. So it's a little bit different. And the argument, though, I think is interesting. We have heard these people before.
Just another question for Professor Catalano, really kind of fascinating paper. And when it comes to identifying these values of whiteness, of heteronormity, of capitalism, of masculinity, how does that translate to what's coming on during the commercial breaks? Do you see those values kind of reinforced in the advertisements that are being shown? What's that relationship like?
I wish Bree was here to speak further on this. There's very sophisticated commercial marketing that targets these audience. I think the genre categories that the History Channel fell into was pickup trucks, hunting, and I forget the third one. But that was the main category of analysis for those wanting to buy ads, that this was your target audience if you're doing history. That these are your individuals who are going to be purchasing your projects. Thus, commercials often reflect the same values. I can keep going, it doesn't matter.
This is the first panel. I'm really proud of you guys. I can't believe it. You did it. Okay. It's amazing. I just thought we were going to give up today.
Okay, so I guess we can field another question or two if things are willing to slog on. Or...
There's more people that have time for the break.
Okay. Yes.
This is primarily for Dr. Lasser, and I want to say I thought I'd escape Brexit by coming over here, so sadly not. I just want to ask you the question, do you think Lincoln would have been on the side of Brussels or on the side of the people who would have said, it seems to me that if you look at the way in which Lincoln has been appropriated over the century and a half since his death, he's been appropriated both by what you might call federalists, or by people who want to hold a union together, and those who want to break away from a particular union, citing the Gettysburg Address and listening to the voice of the people. So I was interested at the end, you said that Brussels lacked a Lincoln figure who could intervene, or rather the power wasn't there to do that. But I wonder whether you might like to reflect on the other side of the coin, and perhaps ask Don too if he might want to reflect on that. I'm thinking particularly, of course, of of Ireland, the island of Ireland, and the union with the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is this question of, I'm going to dodge this question of being a political scientist, follow my field, but no, it's true. It's a good point because it can cut both ways. But I think one of the really interesting questions is this sort of legal question. And I think, I think if we define secession, or we define a category of legal secession, or legally either explicitly sanctioned or arguably sanctioned, then it becomes very different from revolution, which by definition is not in that category. And so I think, to some extent, Lincoln, and I think your paper really spoke to this. Lincoln becomes this hero to the revolutionaries. But I don't think that was really, that's Lincoln's categorization of Southerners in many ways, right? So I think it might depend in some ways on that structure. When I say that there's no Lincoln, I'm in this context at least trying to be a little bit substance-free in the sense that I think you could look at Roosevelt, who also stretched the powers of the presidency, or any of the great presidents. This is what they have traditionally done. I think the only EU institution that has really stretched its power in this crisis is the central bank. And that's probably because they're least connected to politics. But they have certainly ignored what was a clear mandate that would not have allowed them to do many of the things that they did. But it's so arcane and so technical. But there's very little political space to do that, again, for the reasons that I suggested. But I don't comment.
Good question. I'm thinking of Lincoln's first inaugural, in which I think he was the first to compare secession to divorce. And he said that, you know, a man and a woman who decide they don't want to live together can go their separate ways, divide up the property. And so I noticed the British are using that term, that metaphor of divorce. But that a nation can't do that, and that they still have a border, and they still have to live together, and that what is an internal domestic problem will only become an international problem. And then, of course, he made the practical argument. He said that a self-governing republic cannot have a provision, a constitutional provision, for what he essentially said was suicide by division. That anytime someone didn't like the outcome of an election or a particular piece of legislation, they would threaten secession, and it wouldn't work. That the only way that you can have a republic work is that you have free and fair elections, and that if you don't win, come back and try again or give up. Because if you can't persuade the majority, then you can't, you don't deserve to govern.
I want to ask Professor Catalano one quick question, which is this: why are we so concerned about all this? Isn't this what we've always done? I mean, is there any difference between the History Channel and Parson Weems, or Birth of a Nation, or Gone with the Wind? I mean, I'm thinking about our obsession with popular culture. Popular culture has never been interested in serious history, except maybe for a brief period from World War II to the 1980, and then we elected a president who couldn't remember whether he'd seen things and done them, or whether they were in movies that he'd been in, and it didn't matter. So I'm just wondering. It strikes me that this is what we've always done.
Yeah, there are definitely historical precedents for this similar type of thing to be going on. I would say that what has changed is the scale and the degree to which people really buy in and become emotionally attached to this stuff. You can buy Swamp People t-shirts. They know these individuals by name. It's a fandom that surrounds this stuff. And when you become a fan of this stuff, you're not just consuming the knowledge, you're buying into the ideology of it. So we have Parson Weems giving fictional stories to sell books to George Washington, of course. But those didn't contain such dangerous underlying messages as a lot of this content does today. The History Channel complements Fox News fairly well in legitimizing what they see in Fox News. They go to the History Channel, yep, confirmed, go back to Fox News. And it's not that far of a leap.